Okay, hello YouTube. I know it's been quite a long time since I did a video, and you may have noticed I took all my other ones down. It's because I don't like them. I think that I'm not, I don't know, just not so proud of them. So I thought I'd kind of do a reboot of the channel, kind of like like a start all over again, maybe. And I thought that the best place to begin for a reboot would be Chappell's Scarlet Tracings by Iain Sinclair. I read this book mostly because I'm working on a novel about Jack the Ripper, and this was really one of the only Iain Sinclairs that I hadn't read. And when I found out that it was about Jack the Ripper, I immediately picked it up and started reading it. And it actually, to my surprise, has a lot of crossover with Alan Moore's From Hell, which is one of my favourite works of literature of all time. I think that there's something about the way that Alan Moore goes about portraying, the 1880s in London. The way he goes about it is very evocative, and I think really captures the time period perfectly. Iain Sinclair, with this book, I don't think was all that interested in doing that. I think that his goal was more to examine the nature of history as a whole and the violence that kind of perpetuates the continuous cycles of history. And there is actually a lot of crossover between this book and the themes in From Hell. They both kind of are about... first of all, they both work on the same theory, which is that William Gull, the royal physician, killed 5 prostitutes as part of a kind of, full cover-up of a royal secret. But even that doesn't... I think it gets a brief mention in this. Whereas From Hell is kind of very much about that. So basically there's 3 different narratives happening in this book. There's kind of a narrative about book dealers in the 1970s that kind of come across an old copy of a Sherlock Holmes story that has kind of vague references to the Jack the Ripper murders. And then there's a second narrative that follows William Gull, who in this book is the murderer. It follows him basically from his childhood working as an assistant to his father on barges in London, and kind of follows him through his tutoring, and eventually he becomes a surgeon, and we kind of learn a bit more about him in terms of the nature of his psychology and how his profession kind of perpetuates his violent tendencies. But at the same time, within that narrative, there is a examination of another historical figure, somebody who actually existed, called James Hinton, who William Gull was very good friends with James Hinton. You can see some connection between them within James Hinton's collected letters, and also the book William Withy Gull, a biographical sketch by Theodore Ackland, who was William Gull's son-in-law. So we can see from there that Iain Sinclair is working very much with the historical sources, but he doesn't lean on them in terms of detailing the world that Gull lives in. So kind of the way that I work, for instance, and the way that a lot of other people work when they're portraying a historical time period, is that they do as much research as they can and then really weave the elements of what the world was like into the narrative. But Sinclair kind of does away with all that and manages to, in my opinion, portray a world that is very convincing despite its lack of historical detail. And the third narrative that we see is a kind of a narrative that exists in a liminal space. It kind of goes back and forth in time, though whether that's really happening or if it's just in the mind of the narrators is very much up to interpretation. Essentially, the ideas in this book and in From Hell, like I said before, are very much the same, in that William Gull, inspired by the ideas of James Hinton, committed these murders in order to give birth to the 20th century. And that's an idea it's very kind of occult and esoteric and filled with hidden meaning, and it's almost like a code that's woven throughout the narrative that I read this book twice because I couldn't, by the time that I finished it the first time, I couldn't understand the puzzle that Iain Sinclair was laying out. And upon my second read, I finished it and then I started it immediately again. It sort of became apparent to me that, in my view anyway, it's a puzzle that isn't necessarily meant to be solved. It's more meant to be felt. You're meant to feel the kind of overwhelming nature of history and violence and time, and you're meant to kind of extrapolate on that through your own sense of those themes. I've never really been all that interested in the theories behind the Jack the Ripper murders. There's always been something to me that seems slightly distasteful about obsessing over the man that committed these heinous crimes and not focusing at all really on the victims. And in my research, I've read a lot of the literature about Jack the Ripper, and almost none of it focuses on the victims at all. They're kind of a footnote. And that is also very much the case in this. I think there's only kind of brief mentions of their names. But at the same time, you don't actually witness the murders in this book. There's no real sense of the violence that was committed. It's more about the ideas that inspired that violence and the consequences thereafter. Iain Sinclair is also working with some ideas that he began to play with in Lud Heat, which is a kind of prose poem, I suppose, that he began writing while he was working in the gardens around Spitalfields, I think. And he, from being near those Hawksmoor churches, he felt kind of this very antagonistic energy that kind of permeated the area and was connected within the bounds of these churches built by Hawksmoor. And he found lots of very strange historical anomalies that happened within those spaces. And he's woven that through his narrative here in a way that I think not only builds on those ideas, but also improves on them. Also, just to give a little bit of an idea about the sense of the language that Sinclair uses, I will just read literally just the opening paragraph of the novel. There is an interesting condition of the stomach where ulcers build like coral, fibrous tissue replacing musculature, cicatrix dividing that shady receptacle into two zones, with communication by means of a narrow isthmus, a condition spoken of with some awe by the connoisseurs of pathology as hourglass stomach. So even in that, where we're introduced to ideas of the body and time that very much present in the Jack the Ripper case. From the very opening paragraph, he's conveying to the reader that these are the story of these murders is saturated in it. I'll also read just one more passage from the point of view of William Gull when he's a young man watching the body of his father be returned to his home near the seaside in London. The bargemen bareheaded gave way, Elizabeth herself then leading the great horse, the Suffolk punch, that dragged John Gull and his oversized floating coffin through the channels and cuts among reeds, William following, a muzzled wolf. They curved from sight of the line of solitary cottages, the bargemen, their wives, remaining, eyes on the imageless water turned away, so many turnips on sticks. In a place that was neither land nor water, in a field that had been cast adrift, unworked, the horse was freed from his harness, and the barge was fired. John Gull's back was to the sea when his bones broke from his flesh. His skull, lying in only inches of water, burst into flame, a lantern. He seemed to rise, to sit, bent like a dry branch. His bird, a shard of black cloth lifted, blazed, was gone. The woman and the boy stood through the long afternoon. That place was theirs. Unknown, it was shunned. William Withy Gull, his red eyes brilliant in a blackened face, his cropped hair ashed into age, an old man, screamed out over the reeds in savage laughter. That is a perfect example of another thing that is prevalent throughout this novel, and that is the sense of some kind of unknown mystical element. People are constantly interacting with the ghosts of the past and the future in ways that I don't think they really understand. It's almost Lovecraftian in the way that it's portrayed. And you get the sense that Iain Sinclair is making a statement about the nature of our relationship with our past selves and our future selves. The way that he describes William Gull, for instance, here as a muzzled wolf is indicative of the fact that he will later become unmuzzled, and that, you know, there is that violence within him that is present, but through this kind of ritualistic burning of his father's body, it is almost as if some dark spirit within him is released and the muzzle is taken off. There is also a very interesting aspect here with Joseph Merrick, who was known as the Elephant Man, and was actually in the area of the Whitechapel murders at the time that they were happening. And the doctor that took him in and looked after him was actually a very good friend of William Gull. Joseph Merrick kind of takes on the role of witness to the entire affair. And there are comparisons drawn between him and the god Ganesha, which I don't know enough about to comment on, but I thought that they were interesting anyway. If you read this after reading From Hell by Alan Moore, I think you'll find quite a few similarities that are a little too familiar, a little too similar to be coincidence, given the fact that Alan Moore was a huge fan of Blood Heat by Iain Sinclair, and to me that's not an issue. I don't think it's plagiarism or anything, because what Alan Moore was trying to do was explore those ideas from a more historical point of view, rather than the kind of, fourth dimensional objectivity that Whitechapel Scarlet Tracings is trying to do it from. I think to wrap up, I'll say that definitely read this book. It's a masterpiece. I think that it takes a little while to kind of get into it, and you may have to read it a few times, but it becomes kind of like you can't put it down the more you read it. I was trying to read about 50 pages a night, but I couldn't do it. I had to read more because it was just sort of like it sucked you in, and it really let you kind of dissolve into this milieu of ideas and amalgamations of history that are just so pertinent and filled with reverence and meaning, and it's almost too much. Like, you can't, divide the pieces up and look at them one by one. You have to look at it as a whole, and no part is disconnected from another. It all works within itself to create one masterful whole. So yes, that's Iain Sinclair is one of my favourite authors. I'll probably review more of his stuff. Just to quickly update, I am going to continue book reviews on this channel, but I'm also going to be talking about film in a video essay format. I'm currently working on a video essay about the films of Andrew Hutzelack, who is one of my favourite filmmakers, and that should be out fairly soon. I'm not sure when, but fairly soon. So yes, thank you very much for watching. Sorry about the long hiatus. If anybody desperately wants to watch any of those videos I took down, which I doubt, I can give you a private link or something, but yes, so thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you next time.